Hello, and welcome to the Homegrown Fuels podcast, sharing stories of ethanol's emergence in rural America. I'm your host, Retka Schill, a biofuels journalist now retired from full-time work, but still writing about ethanol and other biofuels for Ethanol Producer Magazine and others. There are so many good stories out there about the early days of the ethanol movement that ought to be recorded before they're lost. Writing a book takes a lot of time and resources, but I love talking to people and people love telling their stories. So the idea for this podcast was born. Thanks to BBI International and Ethanol Producer Magazine for producing this podcast. If you'd like to sponsor the podcast or give some feedback, contact us at homegrownfuels@bbiinternational.com. Our guest today is Senator Tom Daschle, who served as Senate Majority Leader a couple of decades ago. He represented South Dakota in the House for 8 years, starting in 1978, and was elected to the Senate in 1986. But before that, he was an aide to South Dakota Senator Jim Aberesk when gasohol was gaining steam. Senator Daschle graduated from South Dakota State University in 1969 before the corn ethanol demonstration plant got going on campus. But I suspect he was one of those bringing tours to the facility. Tom, welcome to the Homegrown Fuels podcast. What are your memories of that gasohol craze?
Well, Sue, let me just say how pleased I am to be with you. South Dakota is where we got started, and gasohol really was one of the most, I think, one of the most exciting new developments in my early career. New developments in part because we were going through a fuel crisis. We were very dependent upon foreign sources of oil. Farmers were struggling with a number of challenges in the 80s, having to do with financing especially, a lot of bankruptcies. So gasohol looked like just one of those magic bullets, one of those things that could really make a difference. I had a line that I used a lot that farmers ought to be the producers truly of 4F. The 4Fs: food, feed, fiber, and fuel. And that's really what turned out to be. Farmers got to be very excited about it. We converted a couple of old cars to run on ethanol, and we showed them at the state fair. And I can just remember the hundreds and hundreds of people gathered around these old cars. You really couldn't see anything new. It didn't look any different, but they were all excited because it was running on alcohol and ethanol, and there was just so much excitement. And then the next phase, of course, was building new little stills. Just countless farmers built their own little still, thinking that they could just be the producers. And some, of course, succeeded, and some organized, and some became quite successful, and we still have a number of very successful ethanol facilities in South Dakota today.
I bet. Yeah, it's interesting how those things got started. Did you take tours to that South Dakota campus? Was there a lot of bringing people from like Washington to see what this looked like?
I don't know that at least initially, I don't think we had anybody from Washington, but we did have a lot of interest. People came from a long distance to witness the facility and to see how it was operating and to see what potential there is to learn more. We must have held literally hundreds of meetings around the whole issue of ethanol. Sometimes it was on site, sometimes it was just talking in a public space at some place, but the interest was just amazing. I did so much of it that I gained the nickname Dasch-ahol, that people called me Tom Dasch-ahol, because it was something I was so excited about and became identified with over those years.
I know the oil companies, the oil industry was pretty opposed to it. But Congress really got behind it at different times. What was going on there? And I understand some of the heavy hitters started backing gasohol, ethanol over the years. What were the dynamics going on behind the support that grew in Congress and the kind of opposition you dealt with?
Well, in the 80s, especially in the later 80s, there was the growing concern about the environment. I think there was a sympathy toward farmers. We were going through a number of farm crises in the 80s, you probably remember,
Oh, yeah.
and lost just a large number of farmers and ranchers because of the financial crisis we were facing. And then, along with the environmental issues, there was an increasing recognition that lead in gasoline was very toxic and very harmful. And so I have so many friends and so many memories of good friends working on this issue over the years. But the very first friend I worked with at some length and with some success was Bob Dole. Bob was the chairman of the Agriculture Committee at that time, and from a senator from Kansas. My wife is originally from Kansas and knew Bob, and so we got to be very close friends. And he too became a very strong advocate of ethanol. And one of the very first ethanol amendments we passed was to the Clean Air Act bill that passed in 1990. It was the Dole Daschle or Daschle Dole bill and amendment, and it phased out lead and put ethanol in as the alternative to increase the oxygen and the octane level of gasoline. And that's where it really started. That amendment to the Clean Air Act in 1990 was probably one of the most important first steps in public policy that allowed us the opportunity for ethanol to really grow and be recognized as a positive contributor to our fuel and transportation system going forward.
Yes, that was a time when there was a lot of concern about air pollution in mountain cities, if I remember,
Yes,
mountainous
yes.
cities. Okay.
Greenhouse gases,
Okay.
no question. Right.
Okay. Yeah. And the beginning to talk about greenhouse gases and the importance of reducing those just started. Well, actually, it goes, I can remember it from when I was in college, hearing some of that. And that was back in 1969. I started college when you graduated from college.
Okay.
So, yeah. So, do you have any favorite stories of some of the inside stories of what it took to gain support from people that were hesitant? Because we still hear that today.
Oh, we do. There's so many challenges we face, especially around misinformation, and that still exists today. There was all this concern that we had to address constantly, that it took more energy to produce ethanol than you got in using ethanol. And so there was a negative energy balance that we had to address. People were concerned about that. They were concerned about what the prolonged use of ethanol would do to an engine, because some of the pipes and other parts of an engine that was made to run on gasoline could deteriorate and adversely affect your car. Obviously, we had issues around heat and when ethanol would evaporate faster than normal, but we had just a large number of challenges that we had to face. There were those who still raised the issue of corn as a food versus corn as a fuel, and for that matter, soybeans as well. And the food versus fuel argument persists today, and for a lot of people. So we had a lot of those challenges over the years, and it was trying to convince. And some of the people that were making the arguments were some of my closest friends in the Senate. So we had Dianne Feinstein comes to mind. Had been. She's no longer with us, unfortunately, but she and I used to have these knockdown, drag out debates over dinner in restaurants, and sometimes it got pretty boisterous. But she stuck to her guns. But she was one of my opponents, in spite of the fact that we'd shared such a close friendship and worked together on so many other issues.
Mm. You know that negative energy balance. Do you remember what I've heard that one, and I have a friend who's a college professor who throws that at me, and I don't know how to answer it. How did you answer that?
Well, I think it's just with the facts. I mean, obviously, there are different efficiencies that come into the manufacture. Sometimes they have to do with size. Sometimes they have to do with the quality of the equipment being used. But science itself is the best resource when you get into these arguments. And I always pointed to the science and the facts themselves and the numbers of studies that have been shown that we have a very you can create a positive energy balance. That's not even that shouldn't even be a debate. And the question is, what kind of energy are you using in the first place to make ethanol? And that too factored in. So I think there are many good arguments that a thoughtful person who is really interested in knowing the truth would be persuaded by when we have these opportunities to make the case.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And the food versus fuel is a tough one to explain to an urban person who's never been in the in South Dakota and saw all the cornfields and found out that all that corn, none of it is eaten by people. It's all eaten by animals. It is not food for people. And that's a tough one to get through to somebody who has so little knowledge of agriculture.
No, that's so true. And farmers are so many times more productive today than they were 50 years ago or even 10 years ago for that matter. Productivity continues to increase. What you can raise on an acre of land today is way beyond what you could have done when I was growing up.
Yeah, you grew up in the Aberdeen area?
I did. Yeah, that was
Yeah.
my
Did you grow up on a farm or did you go in town?
Well, I grew up in town, but I had a lot of uncles and aunts who were farmers, and I used to spend some of my summers in my early years working with one of my uncles on a farm and just loved it. In fact, there was a time in my life when I thought that was what I wanted to do in life, was to be a farmer. I even started buying a few head of cattle just to get started. But I developed new interests as the years unfolded and things went a different way. But I always had a love farm life and rural America, and loved my state and the opportunities I had to get to know the people of my state. And as this issue became more prominent, it became an issue that was really fun to fight for and one I really believed in.
Yes. I've spoken to a lot of fellows from that era who were in the service, and I understand you did some time in the service and came out of the service really concerned about energy security, how little resources we had in the US to produce our own fuel, and felt like ethanol had to be supported because it would be a source of fuel. Um, did you share some of that motivations, or had you run into some of that energy security arguments as well?
Oh, absolutely. All you had to do was to go through the crisis we had during the Carter administration with the long lines of cars trying to get the fuel for their cars, and it was, it was horrific. It was a nightmare, and I think it really created an environment that allowed us to make ethanol one of the answers to that crisis on dependency. We've come a long way. We're obviously now one of the largest energy producers in the world. I think the preeminent energy producer in the world. So things have changed a little bit, but nonetheless, energy security was really one of our major arguments as we began to bring ethanol into the debate about how our energy resources should be allocated and from where we get those energy resources in the first place.
Yes, and then the whole farm crisis, was it a solution to the farm crisis, or was a solution to, or one of many? But that was pretty severe in the 1980s. I lived through that, so I have memories of that one.
Oh, I do too. I was on the agriculture committee the entire time I served in Congress. And it was really one of those nightmares that it generated, if you recall, it generated a number of movies about the farm crisis. I got to know some of the actors and actresses that were very involved because they became real believers. But the tragedy of going to these farms and ranches that were the farm auctions that were taking place, and just the loss of generations of farmers who had inherited, the legacy of that farm from their parents, their grandparents, and even great-grandparents, and the psychological burden it was carrying was just phenomenal. And there were a lot of different motivations to look at ethanol. It was never the solution, but it certainly was a solution. And it was part of a larger framework of things we had to do in public policy to make agriculture viable again. And ultimately, we did, even though even today, farmers and ranchers and particular farmers especially are struggling mightily. Dairy farmers in particular right now are having a very hard time of it. But, we used that farm crisis as one of the reasons for the need for us to develop an ethanol industry. It became one of the root sources of new income that became quite pervasive. And it's now, of course, a multi-billion-dollar industry.
Right, right. So you mentioned the whole clean air era in the 1990s and the Clean Air Act amendments that became a source of ethanol demand. Talking to Doug Durante, he a while back in one of these podcasts, he talked about how a bunch of people sat together and figured out that, if we satisfy the oxygenate requirement in fuel, it still won't sell enough ethanol for what we need to be selling. And thus the start of the Renewable Fuel Standard push began. And I understand you left the Senate in 2005, which is when 20 years ago the Renewable Fuel Standard was passed. But you must have been part of that whole buildup. What was that about? How long did it take? What did that take?
Don't hold me to this year, but I'm pretty sure it was 1997 when another very dear friend on the other side of the aisle, Dick Lugar, and I introduced the first RFS legislation. And we introduced it in 97, I think then again with the new Congress in 99, and then in 2001. So we introduced it. And legislation oftentimes takes time to evolve, and some people refer to it as the ripening of the legislation. It starts as an idea, and you make the case, and you do some hearings, and people get educated, but you don't have enough support to bring it over the line. And that's really what happened to Dick and I and the RFS. We started, and we knew it was going to take a while because people were there were a lot of people that were just happy with what we were able to do with the Clean Air Act, with the Dole approach. What I found is that even the industry itself is so bifurcated, and there was a lot of ethanol opposition to the RFS when we first originally introduced it, because they liked the status quo. But as you said, it really wasn't producing the volume. And so the RFS was our effort to make it more of an integrated part of our fuel system. And that's really what happened. You had a certain requirement that fuel be combined with ethanol, and that became the standard, and that worked very well. It's so funny, within, I guess, the last 10 years, and I've always referred to our work in ethanol as kind of a little bit like the space program. We dealt with smaller rockets and putting up satellites, and that was sort of the initial phase, and that was the Dole Daschle amendment, and then the RFS was our first real launch, and that was our RFS effort. And then about the last 10 years, what we have said is that the octane level, we should attain a certain higher octane level and use ethanol to reach that. We knew that you could bring, you could take fuel up to 30-40% of the mix and really boost octane in doing so. And we argued that should replace the RFS, but there's just enormous opposition within the ethanol industry to doing that, and we didn't get as far as I wish we could have. But Doug, you mentioned Doug Durante. He's an old friend and a real pioneer in the movement. Another one that was one of my closest friends and greatest advisors on this whole issue, is Dave Hallberg. If you've not had Dave on your podcast, at some point you should have him, because he is, I would say, the most knowledgeable person on ethanol anywhere to be found. But anyway, we've made progress, but it's interesting how hard it is to make progress, even sometimes within the organization that you're most interested in promoting.
Yeah, moving beyond the status quo is always difficult, I think. And new ideas, they take a while. They have to ferment a while.
They do. Well, the RFS is a good example of that. Our
Yeah.
first Clean Air Act amendment, I think Bob and I introduced it in '88, and we just got lucky because there was a big Clean Air Act piece of legislation that was being offered in '90, and we got, I think, if I recall, we got 67 votes on that amendment. So we had good bipartisan support, but it was for all the reasons we were talking about earlier.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember hearing that with the development of the RFS, one of the compromises made with the environmentalists was on indirect land use change, which has become a big issue for the ethanol industry because it's started out pretty extreme. Were you part of that compromise? Can you shed any light on that?
I was part of it. I think it's one of those things where there were a lot of different people involved over the years, and as compromises normally end up, no one's totally happy, and no one is walking away with what they consider to be a win. It was that, but the essence of good legislation is compromise, and that's, I think, what this represented. And it didn't make the issue go away. As you know, we're still dealing with a lot of these things even now, even though we've attempted to try to address them, try to find compromise, try to be as engaged in reaching some sort of ability to move forward, and that was one of them. But there's still a lot of people that would prefer a different outcome.
Yes. So coming to a close on our podcast, which I try to keep at around 30 minutes, what do you think the impact has been overall for the industry, and what would you say to the newcomers or the younger folks listening to this, that from the wisdom of the elders who were there when it all got started?
Well, there's a lot of different aspects of this that I would try to encourage people to think about. One is that you have to stay persistent. You can't give up. We've had a lot of setbacks in the ethanol industry, and there's been a lot of revision, reorganization, but I think you have to stay resilient and persistent. Secondly, I think you have to keep thinking out of the box. I'd like to think that the ethanol industry could be used for more than just a fuel additive. I think there's, we're dealing with terrible, almost I would call a crisis around plastics today. Plastics are made generally from fossil fuels, and I've got to believe that finding a way to use ethanol for that purpose as well. There's also, I think, some real opportunities for distillers' dried grain. We haven't talked about that, but I think there's some real possibilities as you look at what you do with DDG and what it could be used for in the future. So thinking out of the box, looking for ways to adapt, being willing to change. Don't accept the status quo as the permanent state of affairs, and be resilient. Those are the things I would think got to be uppermost in the minds of people in the industry today.
Absolutely. And that's part of why we tell the stories of the emergence, because it took persistence from a lot of people to get over all the hurdles and learn the technology, improve the process, figure out how to organize plants all over the Midwest. All of that is an exciting story to tell, I think. Thank you for your time, Tom. I appreciate you taking the time. And yes, we did talk to David Hallberg a while back. So if you search the archives and on YouTube and Ethanol Producer Magazine, you'll find an interview with him as well. Thanks again, Tom.
Great. You bet. Good to be with you, Sue.
Thanks to Ethanol Producer Magazine for sponsoring this episode of the Homegrown Fuels podcast. Ethanol Producer Magazine is the #1 source for ethanol industry news, trends, and statistics. Through the print magazine and website, ethanolproducer.com, the editorial team delivers daily news and industry features to an audience of producers, service providers, and vendors. If you would like to sponsor a future episode of Homegrown Fuels, contact service@bbiinternational.com. And if you have a comment on an episode or know of a story that ought to be shared, email homegrownfuels@bbiinternational.com. This podcast was recorded and edited by Danielle Pekarski, Content Manager at BBI International, and I'm your host, Sue Retka Schill. Thank you for listening. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with another episode of Homegrown Fuels, sharing stories of ethanol's emergence in rural America.